happening behind you. Wow, that is
Is that
cool.
cool?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I wonder what body of land is that?
Well,
Oh, I
it,
think,
it
yeah.
it is Earth. It is Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Wow.
because I
Yeah.
was looking a little earlier and I saw the boot, Italy. I could
Oh, yeah.
clearly make that out.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
it's
Mm-hmm.
where we live. And how
Indeed.
long am I talking about Malcolm?
Yeah. If, 5 minutes or
Okay, all right. I just fine.
whatever. What you have, Lorraine, um is fine.
I'm gonna have a couple of passages um from the book. Um, Carol's going first.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Um, yeah.
Am I
And I
going
think.
after her or do we know?
Oh, please repeat.
I said, am I going right after her or somewhere else? It doesn't matter to me.
Yeah, I think. Um, what? How about Carol can introduce, and then you could jump in. I think those two go
All
together.
right.
And
Okay. Cool.
we have our attendees are here.
All right. Excellent.
So nice to see everybody.
Welcome.
I'll say hello. I'm Sarah. I'm one of the people helping to create this space for discussion and consciousness raising about racial realities in the United States. And we are so glad to have Dr. Penn with us, moderating and centering us, uh, and Lorraine, who will be also sharing. And then we're going to open it up. Go ahead, please, Dr. Penn.
Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm actually wearing a mask because I had a minor surgical procedure and the mask helps to hold the bandage in place. So, learning how to use the mask, multi purposes. So, welcome to this discussion tonight as we reflect on the life and the work of Malcolm X. I'm going to bring us into center with a libation and just reminding us that as a community, may we all be like this beautiful plant, having no doubt in our minds and in our hearts that we will unfold. This plant has no thought of not being a plant, of not unfolding, of not growing, of not leaning towards the sun. And I invite us to be like this plant. I'm also grateful that we have come together tonight in community. And just if I have your permission to continue, let me see a thumbs up from everybody. Very good, which is part of the tradition of pouring libation. You ask the elders or those who represent the elders on behalf of the community if you have their permission. So, and I'm going to remind everyone, please put yourself on mute unless you are speaking, and that way we'll be able to hear everyone most clearly. So, in honor of the community, in honor of the gathering, in honor of all of our individual and collective ancestors upon whose shoulders we are standing, I welcome you to the discussion tonight. Ashe. So we are going to begin. I guess people could put in the chat how many people actually got to look at the film clips. We had homework this time. So if you want to go ahead and put it in the chat that you saw one or you saw two, just so I have a sense of, perhaps how much background information that we would share tonight. So I see one person has found their way into the chat. Okay, very good. Let's see, we've got a couple of responses. Okay, so 2, watched all 4. We did all of our homework. All right, all 4. All 4. So the 2 shorter ones, watch all except the last biography. Great, great. I saw some, not all. All 4. Excellent. So yeah, quite a few of you. So excellent. So we will have a lot to talk about, and we're going to engage you tonight. So we are going to be in engaging you. So yeah, someone else that said my son is named after him. My son is also named after him as well. My son is Keita Omowale, and Omowale was the name that Malcolm X was given in the 60s after his second trip to Ghana. And Omowale means the prince who has returned home. And this was about when he was changing his ideology and he was broadening his perspective as to who could contribute to the ending of white supremacy. And he was broadening his perspective about the teachings of Dr. Martin Luther King at that time, as well as recognizing that there were people who lived in white bodies who could also contribute, who could be accomplices. So yes. So yes, yeah, all right. So excellent. One of the things that I wanted to frame. Oh, thank you. Amy just put them all in there. I've been doing a lot of reflecting on Malcolm's mother, Louise Little. Louise, my goodness, she didn't die until 1989. So she survived her son by quite a few years. Of course, Malcolm was assassinated in 1965, about 56 years ago on this day in New York City. And I was just thinking, as a mother of a son living in a Black body, and as a person who experiences a certain level of deep concern that sometimes spills over into fear and anxiety around his safety and the safety of my stepson, the safety of my husband, the ever-present threat of being male and living in a Black body. What must it have been like for this woman, Louise Little, as she lived through any mother's worst nightmare, when your children predeceive you by whatever means? So some interesting facts about Louise Little. She was born on and raised on the island of Grenada. She herself was actually the product of rape. Her mother, Edith, was 11 years old when she was raped by an older white man of Scottish derivation. And Louise Helen was born of that rape on the island of Grenada, May 9th, 1897. And that was also when my grandmother was born, about that same time period. So there was the parallels that I was seeing and feeling. She was raised to be a Pan-Africanist, and she met the activist minister Malcolm Little, and they married. The couple would eventually have 7 children together. They were harassed by a group called the Black Legion, a white supremacy group that they would move and change cities and states rather than to continue to be harassed by this group. Unfortunately, they did continue to be harassed by this group even after they moved to Michigan, where they were working with the Universal Negro Movement and Marcus Garvey. And Malcolm was a leader and a minister with the group, and Louise served as a secretary and a branch reporter. Malcolm, her husband, was fatally run over by a streetcar in 1931 and would die from his wounds and injuries. There are quite a few that feel that the Black Legion was involved in his death and that it was not an accident. So here she is now, a single mother of 7 children. What she was doing with her career and their life together was in shambles. She was, she was an intellectually gifted woman as well. She was multilingual, and she was very, very passionate about her work with Marcus Garvey and the Pan-Africanist movement. However, she had 2 life insurance policies, one that was larger and would have provided for the widow and her children, and the other one that was very, very small and paid out at something like $18 a month. Well, she didn't get the larger one. They said that Malcolm committed suicide, and so therefore she wasn't entitled to it. So she started to sublet her garden. She was an avid gardener and, taking odd jobs here and there. Oftentimes, she wasn't able to put adequate food on the table, and she and the children went hungry. She eventually met and became romantically involved with a man who seemed likely to marry her, and she became pregnant with this child, and then the man disappeared. She was at her wit's end, and she suffered a nervous breakdown and was institutionalized for 24 years. This was in 1938. And her children would eventually, it was the Kalamazoo Institution for the Insane. And her children, 24 years later, were able to get her out of the institution, and they would care for her until her death in June of 1989. And so I wonder, looking at her life, and I couldn't help but feel and imagine, the trauma. This was, a young woman. They literally changed states. They left where they were because of the harassment, because of the death threat of towards her husband, and then only to come to Michigan, where the death threats continued, and likely, ended up or certainly played a role in what was ultimately his death. And again, just imagine yourself, put yourself in her shoes, and just how terrified she must have been. And it's written and reported that Malcolm and his siblings were terrified, and Malcolm was particularly terrified after the death of his father. And Lorraine is going to share some things as to some of the other events that happened in the life of the young Malcolm, who was traumatized by what he had witnessed and experienced under the hands of white supremacy, and what he saw, how, he saw his mother just struggle and be tortured, and how, he himself suffered hunger from near starvation conditions, and, not being able to be adequately housed or fed, and then ultimately to end up in foster care. Lorraine?
Yes, I am here. Thank you, Carol. And Carol, I have Malcolm's father's name as Earl. You have referred to him as Malcolm. Was his name Malcolm Earl?
Yes.
Okay. I do not have, I only have Earl. What I'm using tonight is Les Payne's book. Les Payne and his daughter Tamara wrote The Dead Are Arising.
Mm.
A new title released in late last year, I believe. the Littles were, well, I haven't read the whole book, but I'm learning about not only the Littles, but how African American families lived during that time period, and in the Midwest. Now, they lived in Wisconsin, and when we think of places like Wisconsin, we don't think of Black people living there. But they did live in Wisconsin. Um, Malcolm Earl was a carpenter. It was very hard for him to get work very often because he was Black. And the jobs that would go to carpenters, employers often would hold for their white employees. Um, but he was very accomplished, apparently, and was able to do some side work, as we call it today, working for white families who could afford to hire him. Now, I wanted to read this passage. I just had my finger on it. Okay. Oh, no. See, that's what happens when you mark things with your finger and not with the marker. Okay. Um, I'm sorry. Give me a second. I'm going to choose another passage. And I will say about Louise, as Carol mentioned about her, she was a seamstress. One of the ways that the family earned income was by her sewing. Now, not only mending and repairs, but she could make a full suit of clothing for a man. She could make children's clothes. So she sewed a lot and earned income for the family. She was also a gardener, being a Caribbean woman that was living a life where they were very close to the earth, and maybe more so than us in this part of the Americas. Malcolm's father was from Georgia. He was a preacher, but that was not how he made his living. He was very, very involved with the UNIA and traveled for them and spoke for them. So if you think about who Malcolm became, the speaking tradition was in his family growing up. The Reverend Earl Little would make his rounds for various organizations and would speak. And I'm going to say that there was also perhaps some jealousy. Reverend Earl would be making his rounds and going to different speaking appearances in a car. They owned a car. They also owned their own property. The passage I wanted to read you was right after the fire in Milwaukee. They had bought a house. Earl had bought a house. And what they learned was they could buy the house, but no Negroes could live in that section. So what good would it do? But they did move into the house and they lived there, and then the house was burned down, probably firebombed. So this is the first really devastating thing. Earl's still alive, so here's a young family, house burned to the ground. The fire was in the back. They were able to run into the front and get some things, but mostly they lost everything. They had to find, of course, they stayed with some friends. People took them in. And Earl seemed to like to buy property or get property that was on the outskirts, away from the center of things. And they did manage to secure another piece of property. And as Carol mentioned, he did have life insurance, and he did have an accident and death policy, none of which the family ever received. I did read that some money was received, but it was used for his burial. He was from Georgia, and they returned his body to Georgia after his death.
Mm-hmm.
But whatever little bit of money was left, we just never got it for her and her children. And indeed, there were many nights of going to bed hungry. Now I want to read this little passage here. It's about the new house after the fire. The Littles' new manse stood as a remove in so many ways from the home of the more typical newly arrived Negro families. The newly dug well on the family's 6 acres reflected an independent, though challenging, existence. The scrappy fourth-born Malcolm was contending with Filbert, who was 2 years older, for the middle spot among the 6 siblings. This was before the 7th child was born. Malcolm and I were always together, said Filbert. Even at night, when we would go to bed, he was afraid of the dark. When he had to go to the toilet to pee, rather than get up and go outside or use a slop jar, as they used to call it, he would pee in the bed, and I'd get blamed for wetting the bed. There are many siblings that know that story, or at least they were when I was growing up. You know, kids have their own rooms and their own beds much more now than when I was a child. I lucked out I was the only child. I never had to share my bed, but many families had their children shared beds. And if somebody peed, 2 people in the bed, who did it? I didn't do it. He did it. And there's one more thing. Yes, among the siblings, the 2 middle brothers, that's Malcolm and Filbert, were dealt with differently. My mother whipped Malcolm, Filbert said. I don't recall my father ever whipping Malcolm. I don't recall why. He'd say, Louise, and she'd get Malcolm and whip him. Occasionally, his mother would allow Malcolm to fetch the switch from a sapling for his own whipping. When he obliged with a leafy shoot judged insufficient for the task, his mother would order Malcolm back to the tree for a rod of a higher caliber. I will say about Earl was very much, in American terms, a manly man. He was the breadwinner. He was the one that went out to work. He was the one that made sure his family was safe and cared for. He was not the tender, loving person. I'm not saying that he didn't love his children. He certainly did. And corporal punishment was not unusual, even up through the time when I grew up, which was the 60s. 50s and 60s. How badly the child was beaten or whipped, that depended a lot on what the family thought of a beating. What was the point? Did you have to beat a child so they learned something and wouldn't repeat the infraction? Or were you beating a child to break the spirit? I'm not going to go any further into that because I certainly didn't read anything that suggests to me that the Littles were trying to break their children's spirit. And I will just say this, Filbert recalled, my father believed in child labor. He thought that children were for nothing but work. Every one of us got a chore. When I was too young to go into the garden and hoe without cutting up plants, I had to bring the water. Malcolm was younger than me, but he couldn't pick up a pail of water like I could. So he would bring the clipper. I'm sorry, he would bring the dipper. When we got older, we were working in the garden. We got up early in the morning. I had to bring in coal. I had to go to the woods and pull out the old dead branches and chop them up for firewood. We had an old potbelly wood burning stove, wood stacked for the day you could breathe. And it started early in the morning. And this was especially in the Midwest. This is the way families had to live. They were very self-sufficient. They lived on the land. They took their existence from the land. And there's just one more thing. Okay, and this is the last day that Earl was alive. Earl made his way beyond earshot of his pleading wife. The children were struck by her lingering sense of dread, if not doom. She was seldom wrong about when she said about something she said she had seen or whatever Wilbert recalled. And as he left, she was distraught. She just didn't like seeing him go. She was certain that he had to go. I remember him going down the road and she stood there and watched him. And pretty soon she called to him and wanted him to come back. She called to him, but he kept on going. Louise had the sense, I don't think it was a premonition, doesn't indicate that, but she had the sense that her husband was in peril and that he would not return. And he did not. That's the night he was killed, and the police officer came to their home and said there had been an accident. Earl was trying to run in to catch the streetcar, and he slipped, tried to pull himself up and lost a good hold and then fell again. And he fell on the tracks and the streetcar rolled over him. I'm not going to go. There was a lot of I won't say controversy. There were stories that did not match. And these were told by the white folks who were explaining what had happened. So the family was devastated. Louise was certainly equipped to work and do some things, but not to be the sole breadwinner, not for 7 children. And not in an area where there was no support. The white neighbors, and their neighbors were largely white because they were not living in the inner city, handled them with a long-handled spoon, if you will. They were not necessarily vicious, but they didn't step up to help. And certainly after chapter 4 is pulling the family apart. And that starts to talk about the lack of the insurance money, where the children went. Some of you who are familiar with the Malcolm's family may be familiar with his sister Ella, who lived in Boston. She was not his whole sister. She was Earl's daughter by an earlier marriage. But Malcolm did live with her in Boston for a time. So this is a fascinating book. It's a thick book. It's a lot of pages, 500, and looks like about 560 pages of narrative is indexed and more and all of that. Les Payne was an incredible journalist. Sarah helped to bring him to a T. Thomas Fortune event. I know there were lots of things that went into it, but it was because of Sarah's steadfastness that he did come. So it's a wonderful book. The Dead Are Arising. I can't share my screen because I'm on a phone and you can't really see it because of my background. The Dead Are Arising by Les Payne, The Life of Malcolm X. There's so much more, and I'll stop.
Putting that information in the book. So it's like 30 years in the writing.
Yes. Yeah, and as everybody knows about the autobiography of Malcolm X, so that's been out there for a long time. But Les Payne was a prolific writer and an incredible journalist. And there was more, and he wanted the world to know more. So there you go. Thank you for that. 30 years in the writing. Can you imagine?
Yes. You know, it's interesting because I did have the pleasure of meeting Les Payne. He worked for Newsday.
Yes.
And I was married to Ozir Muhammad, and Elijah Muhammad was my grandfather-in-law. So this is all part of my lived experience with these people and these names. So, you know, it's just, you know, it's interesting to be living it in this context and sharing with all of you. But what I would like to do is to open up the floor now for some reflections and comments, because you know, what did you learn after watching the film clips and listening to Malcolm in his own words? What do you, and for those of you that have lived through this period, this era and time, you know, what do you remember? What were your thoughts about Malcolm X, you know, in the 1960s? I was a little girl at the time, but I do remember, for example, I really, really liked Malcolm X, but I do remember discussions that my parents were having because there was conflict between how they felt about Malcolm X and what he was saying. And then, of course, initially, the distance between him and Dr. Martin Luther King. So, and you know, and just, you know, wondering, you know, his language at the time was very, very provocative. And my father was more pro Malcolm X and his rhetoric, and my mom was more pro Dr. Martin Luther King and his rhetoric. So I remember just growing up listening to those conversations. And I also remember as a child being very, very drawn to both Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King. And that was, you know, a question, a conversation that played itself, you know, out in my mind, and then listening to my parents. So if anybody else out there is as old as I am and has any of those memories, you know, and want to, you know, just give your own historical reference, that would be great.
I remember Malcolm when he was alive, and in the 60s, I was raising a young family. But the difference, one of the big differences, Malcolm at that time talked about all the whites being the white devil. And he was for organizing the blacks and the poorest, the blacks in prison. And he split with King over. King wanted an integrated society. That wasn't what Malcolm was talking about at all. That was a big split.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a big split, you know, and again, you know, and I think, you know, reflecting back on, you know, what Malcolm was saying, and then looking where we are today, you know, looking at the points of divergence. And of course, before Malcolm died, he and Martin were moving closer together philosophically. You know, something obviously has gone very awry. in the paths that we did follow. And I'm seeing in the comments, I knew neither, but was taught that they were both bad. So I'm just curious, in what ways were you taught that Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were bad?
Mm.
Or was anyone else taught that?
I'd like to make a comment.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Theresa Jones. I'm a Mississippian. My parents and grandparents and all were all civil rights activists. And from a small child, we were involved in community activism and other things, even once we came up into New Jersey. One of the reasons they came here was there was the end of that great migration, but it was dangerous down there. They were getting threats because they were vocal. They weren't afraid. Klan was active, and anybody that disrupted or talked about the reality, such as Malcolm X was doing, they were considered troublemakers and had to be eliminated.
Right.
And my parents and grandparents and all favored and supported Malcolm X because he was saying what people were actually experiencing. So even today, when people hear Malcolm X, particularly my white colleagues and friends, they get it really twisted. They don't really understand he's demonic, he's this, he's evil. They revere Martin Luther King now, but even in those earlier days, he was a devil, he was a troublemaker. So things get all twisted, but they're talking the reality of which those of us who are Black, African descent, and brown, native, those are the things that we were experiencing that weren't nice. That's how the atmosphere and the environment that I was raised in.
Well, thank you, Theresa, and good to see you tonight, my dear. So the reference here is, the warmth of other suns, and she's referencing the Great Migration North, where 6 million African Americans left the South hoping that life in the North would be more equitable, and that took place 1915 to 1970. My
No, don't
family on both sides.
dishes if you're gonna.
Please put yourself on mute if you're not talking. Was also a part of that Great Migration North. Mom's side from South Carolina and dad's side from Virginia.
So I want to share on that too, because I think the videos I found really important, particularly the third video and interview where you got to hear Malcolm in his own words. And I know growing up in white South Jersey, my own mother told me that Malcolm X was violent, and that's what I learned in school, and the Black Panther Party was violent. But I've since learned a lot, and even these videos confirmed that that's not what it was. This is as Theresa was saying, a person who is saying, I have a human right to protect myself and my property. And that is my given right. And I'm not preaching violence. I don't think that Black people should go out and start or invoke violence. This is, people are coming after us and I need to protect myself. I need to protect my family. And when he talked about in that interview, he kept saying the white complex, this idea that it's so dangerous for a Black person to say, I will protect myself, that all of a sudden it becomes this like mode of violence. And it's this story that's been passed down through teachers in our school. And then this idea also that we're taught, I was taught 25 years ago that, Martin Luther King came and fixed everything. So now everybody's equal. And, you still hear the thing that racism is not that bad anymore. And look how far we've come, which just teaches a generation of people to internalize the hatred and the racism that's out there because you're being told constantly that it's fixed. So then you become again angry, or it's just you, or don't play the race card, or, I marched with Martin Luther King, so I know. And again, and people are saying things like Malcolm X is violent, or, you know, and I think such a great thing when he said this, the white complex and this idea of like white liberals who are there and we support and we're so helpful and we don't want violence against Black people, but we're only going to stand here to a point, you know. And I think very clearly of something that is talked about a lot right now, and I draw the same comparison with the Defund the Police. It is a terminology that has been coined not by myself, not by white America, and it is saying, hey, we are being murdered, as Malcolm X said, that Birmingham was the dress rehearsal for what is to come. We are being murdered, and it is in the name of the law, and the law is always protected. And yet, you know, groups of white liberals are like, oh, but defund the police, that's so scary. Well, I don't like that word. And it's like the same thing, because it makes us feel comfortable. And well, I can talk about, you know, redirecting funds and how else can we do this? But for me, I felt very powerful for what he was saying in that interview, where he was going, this is a consciousness because I'm no longer comfortable with the reality and the truth that's being spoken. And I feel like I see that in our own circles, even if we're trying to be well-meaning, you hear this, but defund the police, that's a little harsh of a word. So no, that was just my thought on the videos. It really struck me and I had to share with that. I see lots of hands. Barbara, hand has been up for a while.
And then Reverend Kerwin. So Barbara will go next, and then Pastor Kerwin, and then Jillian.
Hi, it's Bobby, friend of Lorraine. Hi, Lorraine. Yeah, I just wanted to share my experience. I grew up in New York City, and in junior high school, well, pretty much white middle class. As far as discussions that I would hear around the table, Malcolm was violent, dangerous, and Martin Luther King was the way to go. Now, what happened was, when I was it probably was shortly after his assassination in '65, I was sitting next to a classmate who was reading, Deborah Brown, who was reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I thought, wow, this is interesting, you know? And I thought, hey, if she's reading it, I'd be curious to read this too. So I did pick it up, and that was a life-changing experience to read his autobiography. It really changed my opinion of his policies, and the more that I mean, of the man, of having the courage to change his outlook, you know, always learning and growing. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to see the clips that you posted. I will afterwards, but the more I learn about Malcolm, actually, I had taken out the book, The Dead Are Rising, but was not able to finish it before I had to return it to the library. But I just have tremendous respect for him. And I feel his message is very timely. Thanks for letting me share.
Thank you. Yeah, Pastor Kerwin.
Good evening to you all. I think the thing that strikes me most about this conversation is the extent to which not much has really changed here in these United States. Right now, in the recent events of the past couple of months, people talk about a disinformation campaign, but if we are honest with ourselves, the entire narrative of these United States has been a disinformation campaign. Mm-hmm. Anybody who reads or listens to, honestly, Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey, Martin King, Fred Hampton, any of those leaders, the thing that they were asking for and demanding was equality and justice. And when you have a system that is based on fundamental inequality and injustice, the call for justice seems to be oppressive to those who are in power. That's what has been happening since the beginning, right? A nation founded on liberty and justice for all and freedom, yet at the same time, we're going to have these people bound to us in servitude, right? Both physically, but also legislatively, politically, economically. Those things haven't changed. The rhetoric has, the faces have, the marketing campaigns have changed. However, the problem that remains, and Martin talked about it, Malcolm talked about it, it's not the vicious racists that are perpetuating the violence. It is those who are disaffected by it and are pretending that it doesn't exist. It is those in the middle, the liberals, the moderates, and those are Black and white and all other races too, who just don't seem to be bothered enough to care. And so what I hope that this does is it helps us all to take a more critical lens to the things that we listen to and pay attention to, even those people that we hold high as reputable sources, and really think about it this way. Any story you hear, there are three sides: the person side that's talking, the person that they're being talked about, and then the truth that somewhere finds its way in the middle. So if we do that, then I think we can move the country towards the place that Dr. King, that Malcolm X, that Fred Hampton, that all of those civil rights fighters were trying to get us to, is a place of recognition for Black people as humans. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you. Jillian.
Yeah, the main thing that got me to wanting to talk was the mention of defund the police. And I think the main gripe that most people have with that is, well, that restructuring of the police and the redistribution of the budget and well, even then, I mean, it's not the word, it's the sentiment. It's some people disagree with the idea that the police as a force should be ultimately dismantled and maybe replaced with some sort of other sort of legion or facility. And I don't think it's the word. I think it's that people have a problem with removing a force that is supposedly there to protect. I mean, it does often do that. It does also often, act with bias and with cruelty and with, callousness. I do think with Malcolm X, as opposed to Martin Luther King, the latter of whom is often framed as this sort of pure pacifist when he also is discussing a sort of need for people to protect themselves rather than to simply sit at bay of the white man and of white society, namely. Because the problem isn't necessarily the white man. The problem is the archetype of the white man, the whiteness that causes this inequality and this sort of separation of power and understanding of one another. Malcolm X does seem to differ from Martin Luther King, though, in the fact that he seems to have a greater sense of the structural inequality that was happening, and that he was more willing to recognize, even at risk of pessimism, that people need their space, basically. And while we might not agree with the Nation of Islam or sort of being building a Black separatist state, the idea was basically already planted in the society already by then, because there was so much separation already and so much loss of power for the Black man, for the Black woman, for the Black person, in the context of a society that was built for whites. So
Again, thank you very much. Irene and then Lorraine.
I just wanted to give my perspective. I was teaching school in the 60s. I was living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and everything that Kerwin Webb said resonates so honestly with me. One of the, I saw 3 of the videos, and the first thing that impressed me about Malcolm was the warmth and kindness and peaceful aura about him when he spoke. There was nothing violent about him at all. And yet in growing up and living as a young adult at that time, the media presentation of Malcolm, and as Maya said, also the Black Panthers, who I now have a totally different perspective on, but the media presented only the violence that might have been part of Malcolm's language in his anger, very rightful anger about life. One thing he impressed me was that he said the Constitution of the United States was written by white men for white men. And that has not changed. And that is heartbreaking to me because we see that still. And the other thing that in comparing him and Martin Luther King, I think one element that I perceive is that of fear, because this is supposedly a Christian nation. And yet, as Martin pointed out, it was the Christians who killed those little girls in the church. Mm. And it is today the Christian, predominantly, much of the Christian church that has this terrible animosity towards Muslims, towards any other than those who think the way they do. And it is, I mean, I could see anyone who is Black today, the kind of frustration and desperation that when will this change? How can we make this change? Because obviously, I mean, even the Black Panthers looking now at what they did and seeing the things they brought to their community was peace. They were trying to bring education and eliminate poverty and bring food to the children and do so many good things. And yet it is our media and our white power structure that refuses to see it any differently. And boy, that bothers me. And I think Kerwin Webb, you said it all, that things have not changed that much, unfortunately.
Thank you, Irene. Thank you for your reflections and sharing, and thank everyone so far. There's room for everyone's opinions, and it's a big conversation. So thank you for your courageous hearts, those who are speaking. Lorraine.
Hi, Carol. I think you asked at the beginning of this segment about people's memories. As a teenager growing up in Asbury Park and Neptune, I remember when the first mosque came to Asbury Park. It was on Springwood Avenue. It was a masjid for the Nation of Islam. And it was upstairs over some stores. And I never went in, but I remember hearing that women had to sit on one side and men sit on another. And so it made the fact that Malcolm was a real live person even more real, because there was a place where Muslims went to worship. And then also, that was probably around, I don't know, 66. I went off to college in 68. And by that time, some of the mentality was trickling in, like, well, being encouraging young Black men to become members of the Nation of Islam was encouraging a more chaste life. No more drinking, no more drugging, no more womanizing, no more pork. Oh, now that was the big one. What do you mean? And I remember a good friend saying, yeah, I don't mind giving up pork. Pork is not a problem, but I can't give up ham. but that was a real big issue, that what Malcolm was espousing was coming home to Mama's County, not just the not eating pork, but the changing who you were. Clean yourself up. I can remember Malcolm saying those words, clean yourself up. Now, when I went off to college, to a historically Black college, I learned nothing about Malcolm X, at least not in classes. I'm sure there were other organizations and other ways to learn, but I think Malcolm was still a threat. In 1968, many Black people considered him a threat. And the last thing I want to say, which has been really, really important to me, after I got out of college, came back to the area, I became a student of African American history and speakers and lectures. And one thing, and I also began my own healing and recovery several years later, just recovering my mind, not from substances. I was just crazy on my own. But Malcolm teached and preached and taught self-love. You've got to love yourself first. And I remember people saying, well, he doesn't want us to get together with white people. And I would say, no, that's not the whole of it. But what he's saying is, you got to know who you are first. You got to love you first. You can't love somebody else if you don't love you. So Malcolm was a powerful force. I love watching old videos. And a couple of the ones I saw, the ones that we were given, I could see how he had aged, and his life was one of a lot of stress, just like King's was. And it still saddens me to this day that he left behind 5 daughters, not all of whom he met before he left this earth. And that's all I'll say. There's so much more, but that's enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorena. Jillian, do you have your hand up?
Yes. I seem to think that on the micro level, there is room for one to sort of enjoy the space they've been given, and to enjoy the space they've been given and build a life for themselves regardless of what the status around them is, or around the greater society is. And I think that America grants that, but at the same time, on the macro level, it seems that there is a sort of it seems that that oppression is undeniable, and that one's individual will becomes hard to muster But even then, I don't think Malcolm X was even discussing that based on what I've heard today. I think that he's then discussing that Black people have felt downtrodden and not been given themselves the space to, with the space they've been given, not given themselves the space to love themselves, to respect themselves, to build a life for themselves as based on their own understanding of their own merit as a person and their understanding of their own worth as a person. I mean, if in the 60s, I find that it's very interesting when I see all these greats like, you know, I don't know, Jackie Wilson or whatnot, you know, or like, what's it, Cornell West, James Baldwin or something like that, you know, who is, or Langston Hughes, or, you know, people who have existed in that time and have developed worth for themselves and developed legendary stature in white society. They haven't been erased. But the question then is, what space does a person who is most likely not to reach that stature, what space does he or she or they have to build a life for themselves that, you know, allows them space for self-respect? Because, well, I know that in the before the 40s and 50s, before the 50s, I think, let's say before the end of World War II, there was a lot more. There was, the lull hadn't happened with Black businesses that had occurred in the middle century of the middle 20th century, and that lull has often been attributed to, admittedly, desegregation and a sort of loss of financial or capitalistic sovereignty, so to speak, among the Black community. And it seems like well, I guess I'm a bit confused, actually, because there was space at a certain point, well after slavery had ended, and well before, you know, Black people could vote with ease, well before the Great Migration occurred. And then suddenly there was a new reckoning that happened, a new level of understanding, wait, where are we? We're not in Africa, we're not in a country or that is ours. It's one that we were subservient to and that didn't even pay us but gave us a role. And so that leaves a sort of bitter taste and a sort of need for people to gain that agency in their role in this society, as America supposedly promises, as the new world supposedly promises, the new world in the Western sense. You know, a world where people can have self-determination and grow and build a life for themselves, of all sexes, of all races, of all creeds, of all roles. And it seems that in the imperialist way of there being a caste or caste, I forget how to pronounce that word often, a caste system, it seems to prevail, and America, in its constitutionality, seems to want to defy that, but then it reassures us insidiously that it's still there. because it's very hard to break out of your social class, whatever it may be. However, if you know your worth and you know how to persevere to build that worth and nurture it and give it, water, so to speak, it becomes a lot easier to become a James Baldwin or Langston Hughes or Cornel West or Nina Simone or all these things. Nina Simone, by the way, who of course was denied a space at the Curtis Institute because of her race as to study piano, classical piano. Knowing one's worth, that seems to be any activist of great form and formidability, any figure really, will recognize that and mention to people, if they have awareness enough, that you have to know your worth in this world. But at the same time, like, how does one learn that lesson that they have to know that if it's been hidden from them, and if it's been if that lesson has been hidden from them, which I think for most people, not just of the Black race or whatnot, is the case. Thus is the lesson, I think, of the age that we live in now. I think most people are at a place or opportunity to learn that lesson now, especially with the way technology has proliferated, and there's a lot of discussion and fuss about it for good reason. So that's what I think.
Thank you, Jillian. Lorraine, I see your hand up again.
No, my hand should not be there. Again, I was trying to unraise my hand. So go on to the next person.
All right. So perhaps let's hear from someone who is being quiet, someone we
Denise?
haven't heard from.
Did Denise have her hand up? I saw her raising her
Yes,
hand manually.
Yes, thank you.
Skip's hand's been up for quite a while.
So, Skip?
I wanted to express a few things and feelings about Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. One of the things that turned me around about thinking about Malcolm X and away from the crazy press and the media, the white media, was the Dunbar Repertory Theater, who did a great version of the play. It was called either The Conversation or The Meeting, about a supposed meeting between Malcolm X and Dr. King. And Tyrone Lawrence played Malcolm X, and he gave the role a great deal of dignity and gravitas, which comes natural to Tyrone. I think Tyrone has a great deal of dignity and gravitas himself, those of you who know him. And it really made me think about, I think the point of the play was that both men were aiming toward the same goal, wanted the same goal, just had slightly different approaches toward it. And that's what their talk was in the play, back and forth, their approaches to it. And the play didn't end up with anybody being declared right. It was just something to make you think. Now, my own personal experiences with the Nation of Islam, or as a quote white unquote person, whatever that is, and who did a lot of drumming in Asbury Park in the African American community years ago, I often ended up in gatherings where there were men from the Nation of Islam there. And they would stand there very sternly, maybe sometimes with their arms crossed, always with the bow ties. They would never smile at me or nod at me or say hello, but they would never threaten me either. And I had the understanding with them, and it was an important understanding, that somebody talked about respecting and the worth, as Gillian was speaking about, respecting worth. And I felt that as long as I respected the worth of the community, as I was there as a white man playing drums in a mostly Black community, as long as I respected the worth of the community, I was not there to rip it off or capitalize on it, or, you know, make a lot of money from it and treat it disrespectfully. As long as I respected the worth of the community and the people there, they would respect me. And that's what happened. And I did not feel unsafe around the Nation of Islam. It was a very, almost a comforting feeling that I understood where they were coming from. And I think they understood where I was coming from, and it was okay. Even though the words were not spoken, you know, it was just like an unspoken feeling. So that's where I'm trying to get at is I really respect, I think, what the Nation of Islam tried to do. I also felt they got a little off track with their leader, who became a bit of a dictator at times, and maybe they got a little bit off track, which hurt Malcolm. And I also respect very much what the Panthers. I was surprised to find out that Sister Isis was a member of the Panthers when she was younger, and I thought, wow, you know, and I really respect Sister Isis, and she told me all the good things the Panthers did about supplying food to kids in school, breakfasts for school kids, a lot of stuff we didn't know about, a lot of stuff that went on we didn't know about. So I just wanted to add that perspective from my point of view. And if you get a chance to see that play, maybe Dr. Carol or Lorraine might remember the true name of it, but it's between a meeting between Dr. King and Malcolm. It's fiction, but it's excellent. It's an excellent play. Thanks for letting me share.
That's right, Skip. It is the meeting.
The meeting.
Yes, and the play is called When the Chickens Came Home to Roost.
That's the other one.
That was one about, you know, the alleged meeting between the two of them. That was excellent. Denzel Washington starred in that in a small theater
Right.
in Jamaica, Queens, before anybody knew he was Denzel Washington. And before he was with the Negro Ensemble Company. And I did have the pleasure of seeing that. It's very, very well done. So, yes, Denise.
I'm finally unmuted myself. I'm the one that said that I thought that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and the Black Panthers were all bad when I was young. I come from a very stifled family. And I remember when Martin Luther King Day came along, I was like, oh my goodness, they're going to allow this? That's how bad it was. And yesterday, but of course I've grown and I've learned and I have Black children and everything else at this point. But I remember yesterday when I was watching the videos that Sarah put in that email, I looked at Malcolm X and said, my goodness, I understand exactly what you're saying. I believe in you. And it was such a lovely feeling, because what I learned is going to transcend into many other parts of what I'm learning about this whole problem and history and everything else. So I'm with Malcolm at this point. That is all.
Thank you. Tony.
I hope this isn't too far off track, but I'm looking at this in a very broad context. And so my view of this country and what it's about has certainly evolved a lot my entire life, especially the last few years. And the way I look at it now, in a word, it's this country, the mindset, if you will, the policies, it's all about exploitation. And people of color, in a lot of ways, have been easier to exploit than other people. But the fact is, white people are exploited also, not to the same extent, certainly, as people of color. But if you're a white person making minimum wage or anything like that, you're exploited. If you're somebody whose job has been outsourced to another country, you're exploited. If your healthcare benefits have been eliminated, you're exploited. It's all about exploitation. And I think the treatment of minorities would not be as bad in a country that doesn't have a sort of, I don't know what word to use, but if you look at how we treat the environment, how we treat other countries, we exploit and we extract. And that's not what democracies are supposed to do. And we do these things because we're no longer a strong democracy. And the reason I'm saying these things is I think white people have a lot in common with people of color in that we do share some amounts of exploitation. And the way we can stop it is by uniting and finding that we do have this common ground. And when I say white people, I mean white people who aren't wealthy, because the country continues to be run by wealthy white people who have, kind of established a monopoly on the power. And I do think we have to look at the commonalities that white people, let's say middle class and working class white people, have a lot in common with people of color in that we're exploited to different degrees, but we are exploited. And the only way to make change is to work together and to see the commonality and fight back against the exploitation.
Well, Tony, thank you. You make an excellent point. And that was, in fact, one of the theses that, Malcolm started talking about in his later years, closer to the time of his assassination. Pastor Kerwin, I see your hand is up again. So thank you. And again, a good book to read that frames that well is Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, that talks about the upper classes and how they suppress the lower classes, across color lines, to your point. So great. Another good one. Pastor.
Yeah. I just want to second what Tony just said, and it has become the job of those who are in power to employ all tools and resources, media, educational systems, our religious institutions, all of those things, to corrupt our thinking into thinking that the enemy that we have are the people that live in the neighborhoods next to us, or the ones who are coming from a different neighborhood. But if we zoom out and actually look at the situations, we are all the underclass. The difference, primary difference, is that Black and brown people get it first, and then it trickles up until the less wealthy white people, who then start to realize, oh, wow, this is bad. I'm sick and I can't go to the doctor. I have a baby and I have to go to work right after. Well, yes, that's been the case. And that's what the people who the media and government have been demonizing have been saying. So the reason I think that Dr. King was killed, the reason I think that Malcolm X was killed, the reason I think that Fred Hampton was killed, and anybody else who had the ability to speak through the divisions, the artificial divisions that were made, is that if you have a voice who is integral, who is speaking truth, and rationally people listen, now the focus starts turning from the immigrant or the Black or the Jew or the this or the that, and start looking at the systems and structures that are causing those things. And then that's when the power dynamic really shifts. So the problem is that we have not, as people, whoever are on the lower, 60% of the nation, have never actually had a conversation to say, I don't hate you, I hate the systems that are oppressing me. And if you can help me change these systems, then we will have a better society. That's where we have to get to, if we have any chance. Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail, he was basically talking to those liberals, the Christian liberal leaders, basically saying that you have a force in this country, a radical force that is rising up. And he, I think incorrectly, was pointing towards the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X. But what he was saying is the sentiment of being mistreated and oppressed in the country was coming to a boiling point, and that the religious institutions and pastors like himself were not going to be able to hold that back too much longer if things like Birmingham continued to happen. I don't know that we are too far off from that now. And so it does behoove us to really start to dismantle these things. When we see officers who can kneel on someone's neck and not be prosecuted for a crime, right? Those types of things. When Breonna Taylor, person who is sleeping in her bed, can get shot, killed by the police, but the person in the apartment next door, that person, the officer gets charged for that as opposed to killing her. Like, there's something wrong with the system. And until we do something about it, we won't have a say in how people reform the system that is oppressing them.
Thank you very much. Excellent, excellent. Lot to think about in that. So yes, we have to lift off the people that are oppressing, and that looks like, looks like us. It looks like a lot of different people, because it would be a very dangerous place to stay in this being pitted one group against the other. See it. Do I see other hands, other comments? Yes, Irene Gibson.
This is probably a very naive question, but I don't really understand the connection of Malcolm X with the Black Panthers. Was he the founder of the Black Panthers?
No, he was not. But Malcolm X's rhetoric and the Black Panthers are often lumped together by the established media at the time as being bad and evil. And what both groups were saying in their, each in their own different ways was, you have to love yourself. You have to honor yourself. The Black Panthers were, they were instrumental in founding Head Start, for goodness sake, which all children benefited from. And so, their economic policies and, what they were trying to do in terms of, feeding, you think lunch break in Red Bank, the Black Panthers were like that. That's what they were doing, going into the inner city and feeding people, feeding families, providing job training, literacy training. That was a lot, but a lot of that information was suppressed, and just, the aspect of violence, highlighted, because again, it threatened what? It threatened the caste system. And then, Malcolm X, he was also saying, love yourself, love, honor, and respect yourself. He spent nearly 10 years in prison after his life had devolved from, all of his trauma. And, at 9, he started stealing food. Why? Because he was hungry. And that life and crime, kind of evolved. But that's when it started, when he was a little boy and his mom couldn't put enough food on the table for the 7 children. And then, he's kind of spun out of control. But then after that, he started reading about Nation of Islam, not the Black Panthers parties, Elijah Muhammad was doing in Chicago in terms of the literacy programs, the job training, and again, feeding people who are hungry. So thank you for your question, Irene. And I think Theresa has another comment there.
Yes, I wanted to piggyback back on something that Tony said. We have to be really careful and not confusing economics and caste or classism with the racism. Racism is an impact on you if you're a Black, African descent, Latina, if you're brown. It does not have anything to do with your income. However, racism and the effect that racism has on someone, as myself, a woman of color, will impact my economic capability and how well I can do. For example, somebody put in the chat here, Oprah Winfrey is a very wealthy woman, but she's still affected by racism. I think she went into a boutique to buy something and was given a hard time by the clerk because of her color. I'm a woman of a certain middle income. I'm educated, advanced degrees, own my own property. I've had people come up to me thinking I'm the secretary. So be very careful when you talk about classism. Even Lyndon Johnson said, if you tell the lowest poor white boy that he's better than the Black man, you can pick his pocket. See, racism is not the same as classism or economics. So we must be very careful. And that mindset, if you're going out into the broader world with that, it's dismissive of the racism impact that it affects my people. I just want to be clear and folks understanding that. And that's where someone also has in here, Black Lives Matter, disinformation. Black Lives Matter is a mantra. When you say all lives matter, you're dismissing the impact that Black and brown people have had, or the effect, the negativism that we've dealt with 400 years. What we're saying is our lives matter too. I believe someone said that if we meaning Black people masqueraded as dogs, we wouldn't have these conversations. We'd all be well taken care of. So that's what I wanted to be very clear on, because there is a tendency by people to be dismissive and want to make it an economic thing. It's not the economics, because racism is felt by Blacks, no matter their economic status, their education, where they live, the type of job, the type of car, it doesn't matter. That's it.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for your comments and your reflections. So, you know, it's an and both. We gotta look at all of it. So Irene, we're gonna actually get the last word. So come on in.
I don't want to be the last word here, but I would certainly agree with what Theresa has just said. My observation is the people who assassinated these wonderful leaders are usually economically deprived themselves, but they are racists. They have been brainwashed and learned this racism because of what our country has done over the past years since it's been founded. It struck me when I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and what I think I'll always remember is that when Malcolm made his Mecca trip, he shifted from the Elijah Muhammad view of white people, because he met people who were white outside of the United States who treated with dignity and respect. And our country has embedded in our thinking as white people to fear and not respect those who are different. They want to create, you know, a powerhouse where everyone matches the way the leaders are, or the wealthy elite. But I'll leave you with one thought that I have used in my relationships, in finding friends and my partner in life. I like you because when I'm with you, I like myself. And the United States has never allowed Black people to feel good about themselves. They have a way of taking away that dignity and that respect. And I think that was what Malcolm was getting at. He wants Black people to love being Black and not hate the color of their skin, because the white leaders and the Constitution of the United States is written for white people.
Well, again, thank you so much for your reflections. This has been a wonderful forum tonight. So many, many, many points to be brought out, and we could probably stay in here a little bit longer. I do invite you all to take advantage of the resources that were placed in the chat, and we will be back in March to continue. I feel it's like peeling the layers of an onion, right? So we're just, this thought, this perspective, and I so appreciate the deep listening and the mutual respect that people show each other in here. And again, people that are being quiet, I encourage you to participate. You see, no one's gonna, get attacked, but this is a safe place for thoughts to be shared and reflections to be shared. We're going to gather again on March 28th. So I'm going to now just turn over and see if the organizers, the conveners, Maya or Amy or Sarah, do you have anything you'd like to say to the gathered community before we say goodnight?
I'll go ahead and jump in. I think that the plan for next month is to have some youth speaking. So just that's a little sample, that's the theme of next month's program. We're going to have, I hope to have Noah back, who was with us last month, and other youth also who are involved in the struggle against racism and also for equality overall. But particularly youth who have been involved in the struggles of this past year against police murders. And, I just wanted to, it's 7:31. I just wanted to make one comment that I think Malcolm X's gift to the world was his honesty. And he was so honest that he changed he was honest with himself. He changed his position when reality presented itself to him. And he did not tolerate bullshit. He said, this is what I see, and I'm going to tell it like it is. And that, like we've said, is threatening to people. Excuse my language, but I had wanted to say that earlier. And, so thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Carroll, for your very soothing and centering and bringing us together. Your moderation is precious to us, and we look forward to being back together all next month.
Absolutely. Everyone have a good night. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we will see you on the airways and otherwise. Good night.
Good night.